Prince Alexander stood at the towering windows of Westfield Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the ancient grounds that had housed his family for 3 centuries. At 38, he carried the weight of tradition on his shoulders, yet his mind churned with thoughts of modernization that would have scandalized his predecessors. The death of his father, King Edmund, 6 months earlier had thrust him into a role he'd prepared for his entire life, but nothing could have prepared him for the discovery that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. The revelation came through an unmarked envelope delivered to his private study by his most trusted aide, Margaret Thornfield. Inside were financial documents, bank statements, and correspondence that painted a disturbing picture of how the royal trusts had been managed during his stepmother's influence over his father. Queen Consort Isabella, who had married his father 15 years after his mother's death, had gradually positioned her relatives in key administrative roles throughout the royal household. Her brother, Lord Marcus Whitmore, had been appointed as chief financial advisor to the Crown estate. Her eldest son from her previous marriage, James Whitmore, managed the Royal Charitable Foundation. Her sister, Lady Victoria Ashworth, oversaw the palace's cultural acquisitions and investments. Alexander had initially viewed these appointments as his father's attempt to create harmony within their blended family. Isabella had brought grace and dignity to the role of queen consort, and her children had integrated well into royal life. However, the documents before him told a different story entirely. Over the past decade, millions had been quietly redirected from various royal trusts into private accounts and questionable investments. Properties belonging to the crown had been sold at below-market values to companies with hidden connections to the Whitmore family. Charitable donations meant for struggling communities had somehow found their way into lavish renovations of the Whitmore family's private estates. The most damaging evidence was a series of encrypted communications between Isabella and her brother, discussing how to maximize their position while the old king remains malleable. They spoke of Alexander as an obstacle to their long-term financial security, expressing confidence that they could maintain their influence even after Edmund's death. One particular message made Alexander's blood run cold. The crown prince is too idealistic and too removed from the day-to-day operations to notice our arrangements. By the time he becomes king, our foundations will be too deep to uproot. Margaret Thornfield had been investigating these irregularities for months, working with a small team of forensic accountants and legal experts who operated under absolute confidentiality. As someone who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, Margaret had noticed subtle changes in financial patterns and decision-making processes that began shortly after Isabella's marriage to the king. Her investigation had uncovered a sophisticated network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and carefully orchestrated transactions that had siphoned wealth from the monarchy into private hands. The scope of the financial impropriety was staggering. The Royal Charitable Foundation, established to support education and healthcare initiatives across the kingdom, had seen its funds diverted into questionable consulting fees and administrative costs that far exceeded industry standards. The Crown Estate's property portfolio had been systematically undermined through sales to investors who were later revealed to have personal connections to the Whitmore family. Even the royal art collection had suffered, with several historically significant pieces quietly sold and replaced with inferior reproductions, the profits disappearing into a maze of financial instruments controlled by Isabella's relatives. Alexander realized that his stepmother and her family had spent years building a parallel power structure within the monarchy, one that operated largely outside his father's direct oversight. King Edmund, in his later years, had become increasingly dependent on Isabella's counsel and had gradually delegated many administrative responsibilities to her family members. What had appeared to be a natural evolution of royal household management was revealed to be a calculated strategy to gain control over the monarchy's vast resources. The personal betrayal cut deep, but Alexander understood that his response would define not only his reign, but the future credibility of the institution itself. The British public, already skeptical about royal finances and the relevance of the monarchy in modern times, would demand accountability and transparency. News of widespread financial mismanagement could provide ammunition for Republican movements and permanently damage the crown's reputation. As the sun climbed higher over the palace grounds, Alexander made his decision. The evidence was overwhelming, and his duty to the crown superseded any personal relationships or family loyalty. He instructed Margaret to prepare comprehensive legal documentation and to coordinate with the kingdom's most respected law enforcement agencies. The investigation would be thorough, transparent, and conducted according to the highest legal standards. The first phase of Alexander's response would focus on securing all remaining royal assets and preventing any further financial impropriety. He ordered immediate audits of every trust, foundation, and investment vehicle associated with the crown. Access to royal accounts was restricted to a small group of verified personnel who had passed rigorous background checks. All pending transactions were frozen until they could be independently reviewed and verified. Alexander also began the delicate process of documenting every instance of financial irregularity, ensuring that the evidence would meet the standards required for both criminal proceedings and civil recovery actions. He understood that the legal process would be complex and highly publicized, requiring careful coordination between royal household attorneys, government prosecutors, and international financial investigators. The weight of his decision was immense, but Alexander found strength in his commitment to the principles that had guided the monarchy for generations. The crown belonged not to any individual or family, but to the people of the kingdom, and its resources were held in trust for current and future generations. Any abuse of that trust represented not just a personal betrayal, but a fundamental violation of the sacred covenant between the monarchy and the nation. As evening approached, Alexander prepared for the conversation that would change everything. Isabella and her family had no idea that their carefully constructed scheme had been discovered, and their world was about to collapse around them. The young king steeled himself for the confrontation ahead, knowing that his actions would reverberate far beyond the palace walls. The confrontation took place in the blue drawing room, a space that had witnessed countless momentous conversations throughout royal history. Alexander had chosen this formal setting deliberately, understanding that the gravity of the situation required appropriate ceremony. Isabella entered with her characteristic poise, wearing a navy dress that complemented her silver hair, completely unaware that her stepson possessed detailed evidence of her family's financial crimes. Alexander began the conversation with careful formality, explaining that routine audits had uncovered concerning irregularities in the management of royal finances. He watched Isabella's expression carefully as he outlined the scope of the investigation, noting the subtle changes in her demeanor as the implications became clear. Her initial confusion gave way to barely concealed alarm as Alexander presented specific examples of questionable transactions and unexplained financial movements. Isabella's response was masterfully calculated. She expressed shock and concern about any potential mismanagement, positioning herself as equally surprised by these revelations. She suggested that any irregularities were likely the result of honest mistakes or misunderstandings, perhaps caused by the complex nature of royal financial structures and the challenges of managing such vast and diverse assets. Her performance was convincing, demonstrating the same intelligence and composure that had made her such an effective queen consort. However, Alexander was prepared for this strategy. He presented the encrypted communications between Isabella and her brother, watching as her composure finally cracked. The electronic messages were undeniable evidence of deliberate planning and coordination, making it impossible for her to maintain the pretense of innocent surprise. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time in the conversation, she appeared genuinely vulnerable. The discussion that followed was both painful and revealing. Isabella acknowledged that she had been involved in redirecting certain funds, but she framed her actions as necessary measures to secure her family's financial future in an uncertain world. She spoke about the challenges of being a stepmother in the royal family, always aware that her position was dependent on her husband's life and her stepson's goodwill. She argued that her actions, while technically improper, were motivated by fear and insecurity rather than greed. Alexander listened to her explanations with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. He recognized that Isabella's position had indeed been precarious, and that the royal family's history was filled with examples of consorts who had fallen from grace after their spouse's death. However, he also understood that her fears did not justify the systematic theft of resources that belonged to the nation and its charitable causes. The conversation revealed the extent to which Isabella's family had integrated their financial schemes into the royal household's operations. Lord Marcus Whitmore had used his position as chief financial advisor to approve transactions that benefited his family's private investments. James Whitmore had directed charitable funds toward organizations that employed family members in highly paid consulting roles. Lady Victoria Ashworth had orchestrated the sale of royal artworks to dealers who offered favorable terms in exchange for opportunities to acquire other pieces at below-market prices. Alexander presented Isabella with a comprehensive accounting of the financial damage, totaling nearly £50 million over the past decade. The figure was staggering, representing funds that should have supported education initiatives, healthcare programs, conservation efforts, and cultural preservation projects across the kingdom. Instead, these resources had been diverted into private accounts, luxury purchases, and risky investments that had primarily benefited the Whitmore family. Isabella's defense became increasingly desperate as the conversation continued. She accused Alexander of being vindictive and suggested that his actions were motivated by personal resentment rather than genuine concern for royal finances. She reminded him of the stability and dignity she had brought to the monarchy during her marriage to his father, and of the support she had provided during some of the most challenging periods of his father's reign. These arguments struck a nerve with Alexander, who had indeed appreciated Isabella's contributions to the royal family. She had been a gracious and effective queen consort, representing the monarchy with dignity at state functions and charitable events. Her personal warmth had helped heal some of the wounds left by his mother's tragic death, and she had provided his father with companionship and support during his final years. However, Alexander understood that personal gratitude could not override his duty to protect the integrity of the monarchy. He explained to Isabella that his actions were not motivated by personal feelings but by his responsibility to ensure that royal resources were used for their intended purposes. He emphasized that the crown's credibility depended on absolute transparency and accountability in financial matters, and that any tolerance for impropriety would ultimately undermine public trust in the institution. The meeting concluded with Alexander presenting Isabella with two options. She could cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, assist in recovering the misappropriated funds, and accept the removal of her family members from all positions within the royal household. In exchange, the royal family would handle the matter as a private disciplinary action rather than pursuing criminal charges. Alternatively, if she chose to resist or obstruct the investigation, Alexander would have no choice but to involve law enforcement agencies and pursue the matter through the courts. Isabella requested time to consider her options and to consult with her family members. Alexander granted her 48 hours to make her decision, making it clear that any attempt to move assets or destroy evidence during this period would be considered an admission of guilt and would result in immediate criminal referral. As Isabella left the drawing room, Alexander felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He was acutely aware that his actions would be scrutinized by historians, legal experts, and the public for generations to come. The monarchy's response to this crisis would either demonstrate its commitment to ethical governance or reveal it as an institution unable to police itself effectively. The next 48 hours would be crucial not only for determining the immediate consequences of the financial scandal, but also for establishing the principles that would guide Alexander's reign. He had made his position clear to Isabella, but he knew that the real test would come in the implementation of whatever decision emerged from their negotiations. Margaret Thornfield had already begun preparations for both possible outcomes. If Isabella chose cooperation, they would need to manage a complex process of asset recovery while maintaining some degree of privacy for the royal family. If she chose resistance, they would need to coordinate with law enforcement agencies while managing the inevitable media attention and public scrutiny that would follow. Alexander spent the evening reviewing the evidence once more, ensuring that every detail was properly documented and verified. He also began drafting the public statement that would eventually be necessary, regardless of Isabella's decision. The British people deserved to know that their monarchy was capable of addressing internal problems with transparency and accountability. Excess age in themselves. The young king understood that this crisis represented both a challenge and an opportunity. By responding decisively to the financial misconduct, he could demonstrate that the monarchy in the 21st century would be held to the highest standards of ethical behavior. The actions he took in the coming days would define not only his relationship with his stepmother's family, but also his legacy as a ruler committed to serving the public interest above all else. Isabella's response came exactly 47 hours after their confrontation, delivered through her personal secretary, in a formal letter written on her personal stationery. She agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation and asset recovery process, but her tone made it clear that this decision was driven by pragmatism rather than remorse. She requested that the matter be handled with discretion to protect her children's reputations, particularly James, who had been unaware of the full scope of his mother's schemes and had believed he was operating within legitimate parameters. Alexander convened an emergency meeting with his senior advisors to plan the complex process of removing Isabella's family members from their positions while recovering the misappropriated funds. The task required delicate coordination between royal household attorneys, forensic accountants, international banking specialists, and diplomatic personnel who could assist with overseas asset recovery. The operation needed to be swift enough to prevent any further financial damage, while being thorough enough to satisfy legal requirements for evidence gathering. The first phase involved securing all royal assets and changing access credentials for every account and investment vehicle that had been managed by Whitmore family members. Margaret Thornfield worked with the Royal Bank's security team to implement new authentication protocols and establish monitoring systems that would detect any unusual transaction attempts. The bank's executives, who had maintained relationships with the royal family for over a century, expressed their shock at the revelations and pledged their full cooperation with the investigation. Simultaneously, Alexander's legal team began the complex process of tracing the movement of funds through the network of shell companies and offshore accounts that the Whitmore family had established. This investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of their operation, which had involved financial advisors in Switzerland, property developers in Monaco, and investment managers in the Cayman Islands. The international scope of the scheme required coordination with financial authorities in multiple jurisdictions, each with their own legal procedures and requirements for asset recovery. Lord Marcus Whitmore was the first family member to be formally removed from his position, a decision that required Alexander to personally deliver the termination notice. The conversation took place in Marcus's office at the Royal Financial Center, a building adjacent to the palace that housed the monarchy's administrative operations. Marcus, a distinguished man in his mid-50s with silver hair and an expensive suit, maintained his dignity throughout the meeting despite the obvious shock and humiliation of his dismissal. Marcus attempted to minimize his role in the financial irregularities, claiming that he had merely followed instructions from Isabella and had not fully understood the implications of many transactions he had authorized. He pointed out that his financial background was in private investment management rather than institutional oversight, and suggested that he had been overwhelmed by the complexity of royal financial structures. His explanations were carefully crafted but ultimately unconvincing, given the evidence of his active participation in creating and managing the schemes. Alexander's response was measured but firm. He acknowledged Marcus's long service to the royal family and his professional qualifications, but emphasized that trust was fundamental to any financial management role within the monarchy. The evidence clearly showed that Marcus had used his position to benefit his family's private interests, regardless of his motivations or the complexity of the situation. Alexander made it clear that this breach of trust made Marcus's continued employment impossible, regardless of any personal relationships or past contributions. The removal of James Whitmore from his position as head of the Royal Charitable Foundation proved more emotionally difficult. James, Isabella's eldest son, had genuinely believed that he was serving the public interest through his charitable work. His shock at learning about his family's broader schemes appeared authentic, and several foundation employees spoke highly of his dedication and integrity. However, the investigation revealed that James had unknowingly facilitated the diversion of charitable funds through his approval of questionable consulting contracts and administrative fees. Alexander met with James privately, recognizing that this young man had been placed in an impossible situation through his family's actions. James expressed genuine remorse for any harm caused by his unwitting participation in the schemes and offered to assist with the recovery process in any way possible. His willingness to cooperate and his obvious distress about the situation earned him some measure of sympathy. But Alexander understood that public confidence in the charitable foundation could only be restored through complete transparency and accountability. Lady Victoria Ashworth's removal from her cultural acquisitions role required the most immediate action, as the investigation had revealed ongoing negotiations for the sale of several significant artworks that could have resulted in further losses for the royal collection. Victoria had been in discussions with private collectors about pieces that had been in the royal collection for centuries, proposing sales that would have been culturally devastating and financially disadvantageous to the crown. Alexander personally intervened to halt these negotiations, working with art historians and legal experts to assess the cultural and financial value of the pieces in question. The revelation that Victoria had been systematically undervaluing royal artworks for potential sale caused particular outrage among cultural preservation advocates and art historians, who viewed the royal collection as an irreplaceable national treasure that should be preserved for future generations. The process of recovering misappropriated funds proved to be extraordinarily complex, requiring the expertise of international financial investigators and forensic accountants. The Whitmore family had created a sophisticated network of investments and assets that spanned multiple countries and legal jurisdictions. Some funds had been invested in legitimate businesses and properties, making recovery a matter of legal ownership disputes. Other funds had been moved through cryptocurrency exchanges and offshore banking systems designed to obscure their origins and destinations. Alexander authorized the royal household to work with government agencies and international partners to pursue every avenue for asset recovery. This decision represented a significant departure from traditional royal practice, which had typically handled internal matters privately. However, Alexander understood that the scale and complexity of the financial crimes required resources and expertise that only government agencies could provide. The public relations challenge was equally daunting. News of the financial scandal would inevitably become public, and Alexander needed to control the narrative to protect the monarchy's reputation while demonstrating appropriate accountability. He worked with communication specialists to develop a comprehensive strategy that would emphasize the royal family's commitment to transparency and ethical governance while avoiding unnecessary damage to the institution's credibility. Alexander's approach involved taking personal responsibility for the oversight failures that had allowed the schemes to continue for so long. He publicly acknowledged that the royal household's financial management systems had been inadequate, and pledged to implement comprehensive reforms that would prevent similar problems in the future. This strategy was designed to demonstrate leadership and accountability, while positioning the monarchy as an institution capable of learning from its mistakes and adapting to modern expectations. The emotional toll of these decisions weighed heavily on Alexander, who had genuinely valued his relationships with Isabella and her family. The discovery of their financial crimes had shattered his trust and forced him to reevaluate years of interactions and shared experiences. He found himself questioning whether their apparent affection and support had been genuine or merely calculated attempts to maintain their positions within the royal household. However, Alexander also drew strength from the positive response of royal household employees and the British public to his decisive action. Opinion polls showed strong support for his transparency and accountability measures, with many citizens expressing appreciation for his willingness to address internal problems directly rather than covering them up. This public support reinforced Alexander's conviction that he had made the right decision despite the personal cost and emotional difficulty of the situation. As the third phase of the crisis response concluded, Alexander reflected on the lessons learned and the principles that would guide his future reign. The scandal had revealed vulnerabilities in the monarchy's governance structures, but it had also demonstrated the institution's capacity for self-correction and reform. The young king was determined to emerge from this crisis with a stronger, more transparent, and more accountable monarchy that could serve as a model for institutional integrity in the modern era. The public announcement of the royal household's financial reforms came 3 weeks after Isabella's family members had been quietly removed from their positions. Alexander chose to make the revelation during his first major address to Parliament as king, a setting that emphasized the constitutional and democratic accountability of the monarchy. The speech was carefully crafted to demonstrate transparency while maintaining the dignity and stability that the public expected from their royal family. Alexander began by acknowledging that recent internal audits had revealed significant financial irregularities in the management of royal trusts and charitable foundations. He explained that these problems had been caused by individuals who had exploited their positions of trust to benefit their personal financial interests, and that decisive action had been taken to remove these individuals from their roles and recover misappropriated funds. His tone was measured and authoritative, conveying both regret about the situation and confidence in the reforms being implemented. The king outlined a comprehensive package of reforms designed to prevent similar problems in the future. These included the establishment of independent oversight committees with members drawn from the accounting profession, legal community, and public sector. All royal financial transactions would be subject to annual audits by external firms with no previous connections to the royal family. Investment decisions would require approval from multiple independent authorities, and detailed financial reports would be made available to Parliament and the public on a regular basis. Alexander also announced the creation of a new position, the Royal Financial Ombudsman, who would be responsible for investigating any allegations of financial impropriety and would report directly to Parliament rather than to the royal household. This role would be filled by a distinguished individual with extensive experience in financial regulation and public accountability, ensuring that future oversight would be conducted by someone with both the expertise and independence necessary to maintain public trust. The response to Alexander's announcement was overwhelmingly positive, with political leaders from across the spectrum praising his transparency and leadership. The Prime Minister, in her official response, commended the king for demonstrating that the monarchy in the 21st century is committed to the highest standards of accountability and public service. Opposition leaders, who had previously been critical of royal finances, acknowledged that Alexander's reforms represented a significant step forward in modernizing the institution. Public opinion polls conducted in the days following the announcement showed strong support for Alexander's actions, with over 75% of respondents expressing approval for his handling of the crisis. Many citizens commented that they appreciated his honesty about the problems and his willingness to implement meaningful reforms rather than simply offering empty promises. The transparency of his approach contrasted favorably with past royal responses to controversies, which had often been characterized by defensiveness and secrecy. The international response was equally positive, with media outlets across Europe and North America praising Alexander's leadership and the comprehensive nature of his reforms. Royal experts noted that his approach could serve as a model for other constitutional monarchies facing similar challenges with transparency and accountability. The contrast between Alexander's decisive action and the more defensive responses typically seen from royal families generated significant positive coverage for the British monarchy. However, the personal cost of these decisions continued to weigh heavily on Alexander. Isabella, now stripped of her official roles and facing the prospect of significant financial penalties, had become increasingly isolated within the palace. Their interactions were limited to formal occasions and were characterized by a coldness that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The woman who had been a supportive stepmother and trusted advisor had become a reminder of betrayal and institutional vulnerability. The process of asset recovery proved more successful than initially anticipated, largely due to the cooperation provided by Isabella and her family members. Working with international financial investigators, the royal household was able to trace and recover approximately £38 million of the estimated £50 million that had been misappropriated. The remaining funds had been lost through poor investments or had been moved through financial channels that made recovery impossible without lengthy international legal proceedings. Alexander made the decision to donate the recovered funds to charitable organizations that had been harmed by the original schemes. The largest portion went to educational initiatives in underserved communities, while significant amounts were directed toward healthcare programs and cultural preservation projects. This decision was designed to demonstrate that the monarchy was committed to using its resources for public benefit rather than institutional self-interest. The Royal Charitable Foundation, previously managed by James Whitmore, underwent a complete restructuring under new leadership. Alexander appointed a board of trustees with extensive experience in charitable management and no personal connections to the royal family. The foundation's operations were made completely transparent, with detailed reporting requirements and independent oversight mechanisms that exceeded industry standards for charitable organizations. One unexpected consequence of the crisis was a significant increase in public engagement with royal charitable activities. The transparency measures and reformed governance structures gave citizens greater confidence that their donations and support were being used effectively. Several charitable events that had seen declining attendance in recent years experienced renewed interest, with many participants expressing appreciation for the reforms and Alexander's leadership. The cultural institutions affected by Lady Victoria Ashworth's schemes also underwent significant reforms. The Royal Art Collection was subjected to a comprehensive assessment by independent experts, resulting in the discovery of several additional pieces that had been replaced with inferior reproductions. Alexander authorized a major investment in security and cataloging systems to ensure that the collection's integrity could be maintained for future generations. Alexander also established new protocols for any future sales or loans of royal artworks, requiring approval from independent cultural experts and transparency about the financial terms of any transactions. These measures were designed to ensure that the royal collection would continue to serve its role as a national cultural treasure, rather than becoming a source of private financial benefit for royal household employees. The legal proceedings against the Whitmore family members were handled through civil rather than criminal courts, reflecting their cooperation with the investigation and asset recovery process. Isabella and her relatives agreed to financial settlements that included restitution for the misappropriated funds plus additional penalties for the harm caused to charitable organizations and cultural institutions. The settlements also included agreements that prevented them from seeking any future employment or volunteer roles within the royal household or related organizations. As the fourth phase of the crisis response concluded, Alexander reflected on how the experience had changed both his approach to leadership and his understanding of the monarchy's role in modern society. The scandal had been devastating in personal terms, but it had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate that traditional institutions could adapt to contemporary expectations for transparency and accountability. The young king had learned valuable lessons about the importance of independent oversight and the dangers of concentrating too much trust in any individual or family group. The reforms he had implemented were designed not just to prevent similar problems in the future, but to create a culture of accountability that would make the monarchy more resilient and more worthy of public trust. Alexander also recognized that his response to this crisis would likely define his entire reign. Future historians would evaluate not just his decision to remove Isabella's family members from their positions, but his broader commitment to reforming royal institutions to meet modern standards of governance. The success of these reforms would determine whether the monarchy could maintain its relevance and legitimacy in an increasingly democratic and transparent society. The crisis had been painful and challenging, but Alexander felt confident that his actions had strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy's position. By demonstrating that the institution could police itself effectively and implement meaningful reforms, he had shown that traditional structures could evolve to meet contemporary expectations without losing their essential character and purpose. 6 months after the public announcement of the financial reforms, the full impact of Alexander's decisions became clear. The monarchy's approval ratings had reached their highest levels in over a decade, with citizens expressing unprecedented confidence in the institution's integrity and transparency. The comprehensive nature of the reforms and the successful recovery of misappropriated funds had demonstrated that the royal family was serious about accountability and public service. Isabella formally announced her intention to withdraw from all public life and relocate to a private residence in Scotland, far from the scrutiny of London's media and society. Her departure from the palace was conducted with discretion and dignity, reflecting Alexander's commitment to handling the situation with as much grace as possible despite the circumstances. The Queen Dowager's final public statement expressed regret for any harm caused by her family's actions, and gratitude for the consideration shown by the king during this difficult period. The transition was managed carefully to minimize disruption to the royal household's operations. Isabella's former responsibilities were distributed among existing staff members and new appointees, who had been thoroughly vetted through the reformed oversight processes. The experience had taught Alexander the importance of institutional knowledge and continuity, leading him to develop more robust systems for managing leadership transitions and maintaining operational stability. James Whitmore, Isabella's son, chose a different path forward. Deeply affected by his unwitting participation in his family's schemes, he dedicated himself to charitable work outside the royal sphere, establishing a foundation focused on financial literacy and ethical governance training for nonprofit organizations. His efforts to make amends for his family's actions earned him respect from many quarters and demonstrated that redemption was possible even in the aftermath of serious institutional betrayal. Lord Marcus Whitmore and Lady Victoria Ashworth largely withdrew from public life, though they continued to face scrutiny from financial regulators and cultural preservation advocates. Their cases became studies in business schools and law schools, illustrating the complex ethical challenges that arise when personal relationships intersect with institutional responsibilities. The academic attention helped ensure that the lessons learned from their actions would contribute to improved governance practices in other organizations. Alexander used the success of his reforms to advance a broader modernization agenda for the monarchy. He established new partnerships with educational institutions to promote civic engagement and democratic participation among young people. The royal household began hosting regular forums where citizens could directly engage with palace officials about royal finances and charitable activities. These initiatives were designed to make the monarchy more accessible and accountable to the people it served. The international impact of Alexander's leadership extended far beyond Britain's borders. Other constitutional monarchies began implementing similar transparency measures, citing the British example as a model for institutional reform. Academic conferences and diplomatic gatherings featured extensive discussions of the reforms, with many experts noting that Alexander had successfully demonstrated how traditional institutions could adapt to contemporary expectations without compromising their essential functions. The financial recovery process was completed ahead of schedule, with the final recovered funds being distributed to cultural and educational programs that had been identified as priorities by independent oversight committees. The success of this effort provided concrete evidence that the reforms were producing tangible benefits for the British people, strengthening public support for both the specific measures and the broader modernization agenda. Alexander's relationship with Parliament also evolved significantly during this period. The regular financial reporting requirements created new opportunities for legislative oversight and democratic accountability, leading to more substantive engagement between elected officials and the royal household. This development was welcomed by constitutional experts, who had long advocated for clearer democratic controls over royal finances and activities. The reformed Royal Charitable Foundation became a model for non-profit organizations throughout Britain and internationally. The comprehensive transparency measures and independent oversight mechanisms attracted attention from foundation executives and charitable regulators who were seeking to improve accountability in their own sectors. The foundation's operations were studied extensively, providing valuable insights into best practices for charitable governance and financial management. Alexander personally involved himself in the foundation's activities, participating in site visits to funded programs and meeting with beneficiaries to understand the impact of the charitable work. These experiences reinforced his commitment to ensuring that royal resources were used effectively to address real social needs rather than simply maintaining traditional ceremonial functions. The cultural institutions affected by the earlier schemes also flourished under the new management structures. The comprehensive catalog and security measures implemented for the royal art collection became a model for museums and cultural institutions worldwide. Several major international exhibitions featuring pieces from the royal collection were organized, with proceeds supporting cultural preservation efforts and educational programs. Alexander's marriage prospects, which had been a subject of media speculation before the crisis, became more interesting to the public, as his leadership during the scandal demonstrated his character and principles. However, the king made it clear that his focus remained on institutional reform and public service rather than personal relationships. His approach to leadership had been shaped by the experience of betrayal and the recognition that the monarchy's credibility depended on maintaining the highest standards of integrity. The young king also established new traditions that reflected the reformed character of the monarchy. Annual public accountability sessions were instituted, during which Alexander personally presented detailed reports on royal finances and charitable activities to representatives of Parliament and civil society organizations. These sessions were broadcast nationally and provided unprecedented transparency about the monarchy's operations and decision-making processes. Educational programs were developed to help citizens understand the monarchy's constitutional role and financial responsibilities. These initiatives included partnerships with schools and universities to promote civic literacy and democratic engagement. The programs were particularly focused on helping young people understand how traditional institutions could serve democratic societies while maintaining accountability to the people they served. As Alexander's first year as king concluded, he reflected on the transformative impact of the crisis and his response to it. The scandal had forced him to confront fundamental questions about leadership, accountability, and the role of traditional institutions in modern society. His answers to those questions had not only resolved the immediate problems, but had established principles that would guide the monarchy for generations to come. The removal of Isabella's family from their positions had been painful but necessary, demonstrating that no one was above accountability regardless of their personal relationships or past contributions. The comprehensive reforms that followed had strengthened the monarchy's credibility and relevance while preserving its essential character and constitutional functions. Looking forward, Alexander was confident that the monarchy had emerged from the crisis stronger and more worthy of public trust. The institutions he had reformed and the principles he had established would provide a foundation for continued service to the British people while adapting to the evolving expectations of democratic society. The young king had proven that traditional leadership could embrace transparency and accountability while maintaining the dignity and stability that citizens expected from their constitutional monarchy. The public's enthusiastic support for his reforms had validated Alexander's conviction that integrity and transparency were not threats to royal authority, but rather essential foundations for its continued legitimacy. As he prepared for the challenges ahead, the king was determined to build on this foundation, to create a monarchy that could serve as a model for institutional excellence and democratic accountability in the 21st century and beyond. This concludes the 5-part fictional royal drama. All characters, events, and institutions described are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes.